are so lucky. It is such a pleasure to have both Avanti and Ali with us today. So Avanti Adhia is an assistant professor in nursing in the Department of Child, Family, and Population Health Nursing, and also an adjunct assistant professor in epidemiology, which is very exciting for us. Her research focuses on intimate partner and sexual violence, with the goal of understanding causes and consequences and evaluating policies in terms of reducing such violence. And Dr. Ali Rowhani is the Bartley Dobb Professor for the Study of and Prevention of Violence. He's also a professor of epidemiology. He's also a professor of pediatrics, and he's also an adjunct professor in public policy here in the school. And lastly, the director of the Center for Firearm Injury Prevention here at the University of Washington. And his work focuses on multiple forms of gun violence, which they will both tell us about today. So thank you both for being here.
Great. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Thank you for having us. If there are people on Zoom who can't hear my voice, please let me know. And I'll try to be as loud as possible here in this room. Thank you for your interest in listening to us today. So, whenever, as Dr. Hajat mentioned, whenever I talk about firearm violence and gun violence, I have talked to many different groups of people on this topic in different parts of the country. People who come from very different disciplines, backgrounds, and others, and they all have their own perspective on gun violence and their own definition of gun violence. And this area, from the scientific point of view and from the policy point of view, until 1970s and 1980s, really sort of was the domain of criminology and criminal justice system, criminal legal system. And it was around 1970s, late 1970s and in 1980s that, people within the domain of health, like public health researchers and others, really started to think about this as a health issue as well. So there was a movement around thinking about violence and treating violence as a health issue. And very famously, former Surgeon General said this sentence that you see on this slide, that if it's not a public health problem, why are these people dying of it? You may have your own perception of the problem, your own knowledge of gun violence, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page on this. For those of you who may be less familiar with it, if somebody asks you what's the #1 cause of death among young people in this country, your answer shouldn't be cancer, shouldn't be heart disease, shouldn't be other forms of illnesses and outcomes. Your answer should be gun violence. Very famously, in the New England Journal of Medicine, some years ago, our colleagues at the University of Michigan published a study that looked at the leading cause of death among young people in the United States, including children and adolescents and young adults. And they really found this really striking picture that you see here, that the line for firearm-related mortality exceeded the line for car collision casualties, which used to be the #1 leading cause of death. So this is a leading cause of death that kills more young people than things like infectious diseases, cancer, heart diseases, and all of that combined. And this is based on the advisory that was published by last Surgeon General. Surgeon Generals typically don't publish advisories on things like gun violence. They usually do that for things like cancer or smoking or mental health. So this was a really big deal historically. And as you could probably expect, this has been removed from the website now, but the PDF of this is available and circulating among people. And so the question is, from the policy and practice point of view, what did we do right as it relates to car collision casualties and others that have been steadily going down? And what are we not doing maybe right, that the line for firearm-related mortality is not going down, and in fact is going up, or has been going up, especially after the pandemic. And so it raises a lot of questions about the things that we can do potentially from the systems perspective, from the policy and practice perspective, to create a dent in that. And then the reality is that there are many different forms of gun violence, and many people don't know that the majority of firearm-related deaths are suicides. So about 70% of all related firearm deaths in Washington state are suicide, but most people don't know that. And they may be surprised about that, because you say gun violence, they may quickly think about, okay, so that's gang violence. or interpersonal violence. So their brain and their mind has sort of this, bias about the type of gun violence that they define. And so like maybe suicide is not even within the domain of what they think about. But the reality is that firearm-related injury and mortality or gun violence takes many different shapes or forms. It could be police shooting. It could be accidental shooting of a 2-year-old or a 2-year-old accidentally shooting a 5-year-old. It could be suicide. It could be community violence. There's so many different forms of it. And so the reality is that each of these dots, each of these persons that you see here, really, this figure really represents an entire family, an entire community. The loss and the trauma and the grief that ensues this is really, really profound. And we have a laboratory of different states. The United States has been, from the policy perspective, as you know, has been resembled to a large laboratory of these different state policies that, as you all know better than I do, provides an opportunity for quasi-experimental analytic studies to look at differences in policy domain across different state policies, to look at the impact of those on different outcomes. The type of studies that we do, whether it's a difference in difference analyses or synthetic control or interrupted time series, all the stuff that we do in policy analysis to be able to look at the impact of variations in state policies as it relates to a particular rate of a particular outcome. Washington is just to the right of the national average, as you see on this, and then you can see massive variance and variability from, for example, Massachusetts, Hawaii to South Carolina or to Mississippi, Alabama. And then there's the other dimension of rurality, including in Washington State, that as you go from urban to rural, the totality of the burden of firearm-related mortality goes up. But the proportion of the bar that is suicide also goes up. So you can see that the more rural areas have higher rates of firearm-related mortality. And then among those, the larger proportion of the bar becomes increasingly suicide. Now, there are many, many hypotheses about this, mainly among white men who live in rural areas as a very, very prominent group that is a very, very high risk of firearm-related suicide, including those who live in Washington State. But the reality is that even within this state, even within the same county, you see a lot of spatial variability from county to county, from even within the county, from city to city, from neighborhood to neighborhood. And so those spatial distribution also are pretty important and we need to have in mind. And then, of course, as it relates to racial and ethnic disparities, the reality is that this is perhaps the example if you want to highlight racial inequities. I have not seen any other health outcomes that displays such massive, massive inequities across racial lines that we see in gun violence, where a Black man is 20 to 25 times more likely to be murdered, young Black men, compared to their counterpart in other races. And so we're talking about a profound, profound disparity as it relates to interpersonal violence like firearm-related homicide. This is from JAMA. I'm going to change the slide. And you can see the slide when you change and you go to firearm suicide, the picture completely changes. Now we have white people and white communities at higher risk of firearm-related suicide and inequities related to that. But putting people in different buckets, different race across racial and ethnic lines is also simplistic. Because if you say the notion that, well, interpersonal violence is something that is predominantly affects Black and brown communities, and firearm suicide is something that predominantly affects white population, while it has been the dominant narrative for many years, it ignores and minimizes the other realities that we see in the field and at the population level, such as this slide I'm showing you, that back in 2022, for the first time in the history of this country, the rate of firearm-related suicide among Black teens and adolescents exceeded that of white teens. How about that? Did racism in this country start in 2022? No. So why is it that the lines are showing what you see here? And so what are the potential explanations for Black teens, including female Black teens, showing the higher rates of firearm suicide at an incredibly high level that we hadn't seen before? What are the potential hypotheses? What are the potential sociologic or societal pathology or systemic and societal factors, including racism in its new form, that are affecting this population that lead to this picture that you see. I don't know if anybody knows, but people are obviously hypothesizing about some of these trends. So my point, putting people in different buckets is simplistic and ignores some of these nuances that you see. Now, of course, I've been talking a lot about death. And of course, many of these talks are very heavy, very traumatic. And so please make sure that you take care of yourself, or if you need to give yourself a pause or a break, please do that. But the reality is that a lot of people get shot and they don't die. A lot of people get shot in this country and they need to live with a lot of sequelae, with a lot of emotional, mental, psychological and physical trauma related to non-fatal firearm-related injury. From the same report by Surgeon General, you can see this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can see that millions and millions of people may observe, may witness shooting. They may not be shot, but they are those people who live in those communities that witness this. What about that trauma? What about what's called vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, that you belong to a particular religion or particular ideology or political culture or political country, and people who look like you are shot? How does it affect you, right? How does it affect you? Whether it is, based on religion, we've had examples of that within Jewish community, within Muslim community, within Christian community, in churches, and the recent shooting in Australia and all of that. How does it affect you as a Jewish person, as a Muslim person, as a Christian person, or whether it's a country where your fellow citizens are getting shot? How does it affect you, right? So those examples are a lot of that. These numbers that you see here are a weighted average of what you see in different communities in the country. 19% had a family member who was killed by a firearm. There are communities I talk to where they smile when they see 19%. Are you joking? In my community, 95% of people have a family member who has been shot. So of course, that's a weighted average of what you see across all these smaller groups. And I'm not going to go into this because of time, but of course, in terms of ideology and consequences, causes and consequences, I think for a bright audience like this, none of this is new. You probably know all of this, but all of this requires conversation and scoping and looking at how we could potentially make a dent in this and create some progress. And the cost of this is huge. Medical cost of it is tiny, very, very small. Compared to relatively to what we talk about, potential years of life that's lost, productivity that's lost, because especially when it affects young people, it really has a profound impact on the society as a whole. The medical cost of it is relatively small compared to other costs. But of course, I can just go on and on for hours and talk about problems and give you examples of people who have actually been shot and tell you stories of those. We don't have time for that. But we do have solutions for it across the different levels and layers of the onion of socio-ecological model, where you can work at the very peripheral level of policy, like those of you who are here, or go down a little bit more in the community or peers or schools or individual level. And one example of that Dr. Adhia is going to talk about is domestic violence and its intersection with gun violence. Every type of violence that you think about in this country, with about 400 million guns, is going to have some sort of intersection with guns, whether it's child maltreatment or sexual violence or intimate partner violence or suicide or youth violence, child abuse, elder abuse, you name it. Guns are going to be there. The question is for which of them we can actually have some solutions that may result in some change. And do we have empiric evidence to be able to create that change? So let's talk about domestic violence as an example of that today in this session. And of course, we'll be happy to talk to you later about some other topics.
Okay, so just to quickly orient you to intimate partner violence, or IPV, it includes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, and psychological or emotional harm by a current or former partner. And we think of it sort of occurring on this continuum of frequency and severity, with the right-hand side of this really being this chronic, ongoing, severe pattern of abuse that involves maintaining power and control over a partner. And a quick note about terminology here. Sometimes IPV is used interchangeably with domestic violence, although technically domestic violence is a broader term that encompasses other forms of household violence. But you'll see sort of both of them throughout this talk. So to give you a sense of how prevalent this is, these are data from a national CDC survey of adult women and men in the US from 2016 and 2017. And if you're wondering why I'm showing you data that are so old, is because this is the most recent data that we have that's nationally representative. They are saying that the 2023 data is coming soon. Unclear, but that's sort of the state of the country's IPV surveillance right now. And in the top two bars here, we see that nearly half of women and over 40% of men in the US report experiencing some form of IPV in their lifetime, with the subtypes shown here, where physical violence is the most common type reported. And then you'll notice as we get to severe physical violence, sexual violence, and stalking, there's much more of a difference in the prevalence between men and women as we get to these more severe types of violence. So there are a lot of limitations to this survey, but I think the real takeaways here are just how large these percentages are. They translate to many, many billions of people in the country. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, but there's been a lot of research documenting the consequences and impact of IPV, including mental, physical, and reproductive health outcomes. Research also really has shown that the burden of IPV extends beyond just the survivor involved to children and families that are exposed to this. And just as Ali showed for gun violence, this translates to huge lifetime economic burdens of trillions of dollars in the US, from costs like healthcare costs, but also lost productivity and costs in the criminal legal system. So how do we think about prevention of IPV? So the CDC has this package of evidence-based interventions that there is research on to support that they are effective in some way in preventing IPV. And there are these 6 strategies that they outline, including teaching safe and healthy relationship skills, engaging influential adults and peers, disrupting developmental pathways towards IPV, strengthening economic supports for families, creating protective environments, and supporting survivors to increase safety and lessen harms. And this package that they have has a number of different approaches within each of these broader strategies. But one of the ones I wanted to focus on was an intervention that I think aligns well with supporting survivors to increase safety and lessen harms, which is firearm relinquishment for civil protection orders. So we know that firearms play a really consequential role in IPV and domestic violence. Over half of domestic homicides in the US are perpetrated with firearms. And within abusive relationships, the risk of homicide increases 5-fold when a partner has access to a firearm. We also know that children who are exposed to IPV also face risk for firearm-related harm. So nearly 2/3 of child death in the context of IPV involve firearms. And then outside of just the extreme outcome of homicide, firearms can also be used to intimidate, threaten, hit, just generally cause a lot of fear and non-fatal injuries, and help to perpetuate coercive control. So one approach to increasing safety for survivors is through civil domestic violence protection orders, which I'll abbreviate to DVPOs. So these are a survivor-initiated legal intervention, but in the civil system, not the criminal system. And these are court-ordered to protect an individual from another whose behavior is abusive or threatening. And they can function in a lot of different ways. They can prohibit contact with a partner. They can prohibit additional violence. They can exclude a partner from a shared residence. There might be custody stipulations or child support or requirements for counseling. And then there's also some conditions on firearm possession. And one of the widely reported statistics is that about 20% of women who experience IPV obtain a DVPO. And so they're not necessarily a desirable or appropriate intervention for all survivors, but they have been shown to be associated with a decreased risk of new episodes of violence and homicide, and sometimes can increase feelings of well-being or safety for survivors. So because firearms are so lethal and so commonly used in abusive relationships, federal law prohibits individuals who are subject to a DVPO, so in the legal system called a respondent, from purchasing or possessing a firearm. And this federal law was upheld by the Supreme Court in the 2024 Rahimi case, which maybe you've heard of. But even though this federal law exists, there aren't actually good mechanisms or defined processes in place to formally implement or enforce this federal law. So in a lot of cases, people can easily continue to possess their firearms. So a lot of states have enacted similar or stronger prohibitions to try to strengthen that federal law. So by 2022, 21 states that are shown in purple on this map, including Washington, enacted stronger laws, some of them authorizing judges to consider requiring some individuals to actually relinquish their firearms. So not only are you not allowed to purchase a new firearm, you also have to give up all the firearms that you currently have, and you're not allowed to access somebody else's firearm. So Washington enacted their law strengthening the federal law in 2014, and this granted courts authority to order individuals to relinquish their weapons, including firearms. And the orders are called orders to surrender weapons. Courts basically explicitly order somebody to relinquish their weapons, most often to law enforcement. And then if somebody gets ordered to do this, they have to provide proof that they've relinquished their firearms and a receipt to the court. And then all of these forms get sort of put into their case file. And so while the 2014 law gave courts this authority, there was still not a lot of guidance or practice guidance about how to implement this firearm relinquishment. So between 2014 and 2017, the law was technically in effect in Washington, but not really well implemented in any of the counties. There wasn't really investigations happening about who had a firearm. Firearms weren't necessarily actively removed from individuals. And so compliance was really based on an honor system. And still today, there's not really consistent application of the law statewide, and the implementation really varies by county. In 2018, King County was the first to actively build infrastructure to help implement this law, and they were followed then by Spokane in Eastern Washington. And so they created this unit called the Regional Domestic Violence Firearms Enforcement Unit, or RDVFEU. And their goal was to help enforce these firearm laws. And so this unit is super multidisciplinary, and they essentially help courts and law enforcement respond to cases that involve firearms. So they review petitions for mention of firearms, they'll interview friends and family and survivors, they'll try to get information about the quantity and location of people's firearms. They'll try to look at purchase history, and then they'll provide all that information to the court to help document it, and then they'll help also document whether relinquishment is happening. And the RDVFEU was the first unit of its kind in the country, and has been a model, I think, for a lot of other jurisdictions that are considering how do they help actually implement these laws better. So over the past few years, our team at the UW, Ali and I have been working with our wonderful colleague, Dr. Alice Ellison, who is leading this evaluation of the RDVFEU to evaluate the unit's work. And this is something that we've been doing in close partnership with the unit. They've really wanted a way to use research to figure out what's working, what isn't working. They're interested in understanding how to modify their own processes, but also, because this unit has been sort of a national example, trying to understand what the impacts are as other places consider having these kinds of things. And I think this has been a really nice example of a partnership that has really improved the rigor and quality of the evaluation that we've been able to do with their deep knowledge of what they're actually doing in practice. So for the evaluation, we've been focusing on two main pieces. The first was to quantify firearm relinquishment in the county. So how much is the unit actually increasing orders to relinquish weapons, and then actual relinquishment of those weapons. And then the second was to understand the effectiveness of the unit on public safety, here measured as arrests by the people who were subject to a protection order. So this evaluation was super labor intensive. We had, I don't know, maybe like 8 research staff who collected data, manually reviewing over 6,000 petitions from 2014 to 2020 at the King County Courthouse. And they reviewed all these different forms. They reviewed the actual petitions that survivors completed. They reviewed the orders that were granted, the relinquishment documents. And then they put all of this into a database about the DDPO process. So they included demographic information, the types of violence that were reported, and then all of the conditions of the DDPO and their relinquishment. And then we linked DDPO respondents to their arrest history using the Washington State Patrol data. So just to give you a brief overview of our results, in terms of process outcomes, we found that the RDV-FEU unit was associated with significant improvements in actual orders to relinquish weapons and firearms, in respondents actually documenting their compliance with relinquishing those weapons, and then in individuals actually relinquishing the weapons and firearms. And so there have been, I think, massive improvements in pre and post unit, though there's still, I think, a long way to go. There's still many cases that we saw that there's room for improvement in terms of actual relinquishment, and still cases where the orders aren't even being given.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
On the back of this.
Yeah.
So on the first statistic on the left,
Yeah.
maybe could you explain that a little bit more? So did the person have a fire? So there's an RDA.
Yeah.
Does that mean that there is a firearm involved in this IPV?
Not necessarily.
And so are those people in that, the denominator, are they all armed?
No, that's a great question. They are not. So this is just in who is ordered to relinquish their weapons, but not all of them are, or they don't know if they are or not. But a judge can order it not knowing if they are or do not possess a firearm.
So they don't find out ahead of time.
Yeah, yeah. And it's even been hard for us to know, even on the back end, or for this unit to even figure out whether somebody has a firearm. If they say they don't have a firearm, you have to do a lot of vetting to figure out if that's true or not, and that takes a lot of labor. And even with this unit, they aren't able, because of the volume, they're not able to investigate every single case. So they sort of look at what they're deeming sort of the highest risk cases. If there's children involved or other factors that they think this is like a really high risk case, then they'll do more investigation on those. But for that, it doesn't necessarily mean that they had one. And then in terms of the effectiveness of the unit on public safety outcomes, we looked at respondents getting arrested for crimes before and after the unit. And using survival analysis, we found a 27% reduction in subsequent crimes in the 2 years following the DDPO after the unit was implemented. And other analyses that we did showed that the severity of the crimes also decreased after the unit. So crimes that may have been sort of more violent crimes, they were more likely to be non-violent crimes after the unit. And this paper with these results just came out like this week. So take a look if you are more interested. So overall, we saw that the unit was effective in reducing the number and severity of arrests. That's obviously just one outcome that matters here. There will be more results from this. So we received funding from the CSDE a couple of years ago and have expanded this evaluation to include more counties. So instead of just King County and the RDV-FEU, we're now collecting DDPO information from 4 counties. So we have added Spokane County as another place where there is a similar sort of unit and the law is being implemented. And then we have 2 counties where there is not a unit like that, and we're considering those are control counties. We've added more years of data, and we've now collected data on about 12,000 DVPOs, and we're just starting to do some of those analyses, and we're also expanding the outcomes that we're looking at to include survivor outcomes of injury and death, and we're also trying to understand more about whether these are implemented equitably for survivors in different racial and ethnic groups, and if there's differential impacts. And then there's also a qualitative component of this grant where we've been talking to survivors who have gone through this process and learning more about their relinquishment.
Okay, Thank you so much, Avanti. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about taking a step back and see where we are, and definitely aiming to finish by 1:10 or 1:15 or so to give you some 10-15 minutes for questions. And obviously we are delighted to talk to you afterwards as well, or you can email us to talk about any of these topics in more depth. But I wanted to take a step back as I was thinking about today, and for this policy, mainly policy scholar audience, to talk a little bit about implementation. Because I was talking to an implementation science group last week, and some of these topics came up, and I felt like, I've been in this field for now 15 years, and when I think about broadly about policy and policy effect, I really feel like one of the biggest shortcomings in the field as a whole is our lack of focus and attention to implementation of these policies. And so I don't know if you have read this paper. If you haven't read the paper, I highly recommend. Jonathan wrote this paper it's a very simple, very basic, as you see in the title, way of thinking about policy implementation science, which is perhaps simple for this audience, but it does help people like me who are not necessarily policy scholars to understand different ways in which policy, whether as the thing that you measure implementation, or the thing that you want to adopt, or the thing that explains the context. I like the way that he has explained policy in this way. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you take a look. So as it relates to those social ecologic model, I mentioned that the periphery of that onion of social ecologic model, we focus on policy. So Rand, some years ago, invested millions of dollars on what's called the science of gun policy, taking a really, really big step in understanding a large systematic review of a variety of different policy outcomes in the field, and really reaching the conclusion that there is a lot of blank cells in these matrices or tables that look at different outcomes that you see in the rows, and different policies that you see in the columns, including, for example, domestic violence related policy that you see as one of those columns, as Dr. Adhia mentioned. So F is like strong, still kind of a low bar when you have like a couple of longitudinal analyses of this, and then indeterminate, and then, medium level, maybe low level of strength in terms of what we know. The totality of the picture is that there are lots of blank cells here. Each of them could be a proposal. Each of them could be a new paper. Each of them could be a new project to look at the impact of a particular policy on a particular outcome. But in making causal inference about the impact of a policy and outcome, of course, you need to know about the implementation of the policy and issues around compliance and enforcement. And that's the one that is one of the problems in the field, is that we have this fallacy of policy being on the book, and really thinking about it as almost like a 1-0 lever that on and off, without really thinking about the nuances around implementation of it. And so, as you all know very well, it could lack funding, it could go into effect with some delay, the practitioners and stakeholders and the actors may not be trained to actually do it. So what's the point of having it just on the books without actually implementing? And in fact, there are situations for DV, for example, that those things are not in place. The King County one is a shining example of that. This is the first unit of its kind in the entire country, as Dr. Adhia mentioned. People in that unit, they have testified in front of the United States Senate. The videos of that's available about their unit. Like, everybody talks about King County in the entire country as an example of a unit that was established for this. Most of the rest of the country doesn't have this. And so how do you, or at least they didn't have it originally. So how do you go about implementing this policy of a strengthening relinquishment as it relates to domestic violence? Because we have quasi-experimental studies, difference in different studies, synthetic control studies, and others that show that, for example, those states that have policies that are stronger in this are associated with certain reduction, 5, 10, 20% reduction in intimate partner homicide, for instance. So that's great. But then what do we do about actually trying to implement it to make that perhaps more powerful? So a couple of these examples are the one that Dr. Adhia already mentioned, led by Dr. Alice Ellison, who's also a CSDE affiliate, that we have shown some of the first work of this type that shows really goes deep and thinks about implementation of these. And speaking of race and racism and what I mentioned in the first part of my talk, focusing on implementation also focuses you, centers you around issues of equity too, because the policy may be implemented and enforced. Well, is it being implemented and enforced and reinforced equitably or not? That's a really important question too, which we shouldn't forget, which we have done some work about that as well. Some years ago, we did a national survey to look at the knowledge of people on gun policies that we felt are those policies that people's knowledge of those policies may have an impact on their effect. Let me say that again. We looked at certain policies that we felt like people knowing about the policy may be on the causal pathway, may be a mediator, may be required for the policy to work. Let me give you an example. Child access prevention laws, CAP laws. Child access prevention laws, they provide civil or criminal liability for parents, for caregivers, whose child may access a gun. They are not authorized to do that and kill somebody, shoot somebody. Good example of that, parents in Michigan that there were in the news about the shooting that happened there a couple of years ago, and they were in trial. We did a study of that nationally to see whether people know what the state policies are in the state that they reside in. Guess what? We found this not very happy picture. There are many people who don't know their state policy. The rows show what's actually happening. Does the state actually have it or doesn't have the policy? And the columns show among gun owners and non-gun owners, do they know whether they live in a state that has this policy or not? Many people didn't know. They didn't know, or they were not sure. So if the knowledge is part of the causal mechanism or causal mechanistic pathway by which the policy may have an impact, what do you do about this? And so these are some open questions in front of all of us. There are examples in the literature that we have done, the people have done cross-experimental analysis. They have shown that like this particular policy was associated with 90% reduction. I'm not saying 19, I'm saying 90%, 90% reduction in gun homicide. So right off the bat, any policy, I mean, you please correct me, you're the experts, but any policy that's associated with 90% reduction in outcome, wow, that would be an amazing policy. But we think probably a lot of it is bias. And it has turned out that some of those were never implemented. Zero. Policy effectiveness should be 0% if it has never been even implemented. So we're talking about a lot of confounding. We're talking a lot about bias. And on top of that, we talk about EBI all the time, evidence-based interventions. What does evidence-based mean? Does evidence-based relate and resonate with communities? Who came up with the evidence? Who designed the evidence? Who validated the evidence? Among whom they validated the evidence? Are the tools and instruments that we use, all those related and relevant to the communities that are mostly impacted? I'm not so sure. It's a loaded term. And people I work with, perhaps most of them Black and brown communities are affected by gun violence. They show a reaction to the term evidence-based. Because the question is, well, tell me about that evidence and for whom it has been designed and how it has been designed and who it's going to be impacting. So we're going to end and open to Q&A to answer all your questions, but I'm just going to promote our center very shamelessly here. It's usually not my nature, those of you who know, but I'm going to say it. Please visit our website. We have a whole center at the University of Washington related to firearm injury prevention. We are the main hub of research in this topic in the state of Washington, and perhaps the whole WAMI region or many, many other states around us. And we have a lot of things there in terms of podcasts, flyers, research briefs, and other resources that some of you may find helpful. We've been building on those relationships, including our relationship with Professor Hill, who's sitting here, Dr. Hill, who we've been working for years, working in policy evaluations, and for Evans and for CSDE to be involved in our work. We are just, it would be an amazing opportunity, and we'll be very grateful. So for that, I'll end and happy to answer any questions that you have.
Blow everybody away.
Get started. So thank you both. That was really interesting and so comprehensive. There was an NPR story recently about different demographics now being interested in gun ownership, specifically like more liberal groups interested in gun ownership. And your presentation made me realize that I've thought about that within the context of political violence, and that's also how the story was framed. But it also made me think a lot about suicide, which might be something that's completely, I mean, it wasn't discussed at all in this conversation. And I'm just curious, I don't know, what are your thoughts on how different demographics are, how demographics are changing? Like that one stat that you showed in 2022 about different kinds of, like essentially Black teens committing suicide. Really surprising, so different than the narratives that we're used to.
Yeah, you want to start? Yeah. Right. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that's a great reminder. So the question, which is a really great question for people on Zoom, is that what are your reactions about potentially changing dynamic of the social demographic characteristics and socioeconomic position of people who are purchasing firearms and become gun owners more recently in the past few years that might be a little bit different from the traditional narrative has said. And so 100%, great question. We have papers, if you want, to share with you that empirically documents that the composition of gun owning community in the United States is changing and changing rapidly. Again, the narrative, the dominant narrative for years that these are white men, rural area gun owners is so simplistic and not realistic compared to what we see, considering in what we see in the literature. A lot of people in the Black and Brown community, especially in light of the pandemic, after the pandemic, and also because of the social racial justice uprising after George Floyd's murder, they became gun owners. We have great papers I can share with you. Trans community, LGBTQ community, many of them became increasingly gun owners. So it's a highly diverse, vibrant community of gun owners in the United States and counting. It's increasing over time. And so you bring up a really good point that while there has been a lot of attention recently on political violence, and our colleagues at UC Davis, they are doing great work in political violence and very relevant timely too. We shouldn't forget about other forms of violence or harm, including self-directed harm, because when you bring guns in home, there is empiric evidence that the risk of suicide for all members of the household increases by 3 to 4-fold. And when you combine that with some other risk factors for suicide and self-harm, such as depression, mental health, stigma, speaking of LGBTQ community, when you combine that, then you have a situation that is really, really concerning and calls for intervention.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So the policy stuff you presented was really interesting, and it seems like such a complex sort of landscape. And so I'm struck by how the policy that Avanti described is a very specific policy, right? Very much tailored to domestic violence or IPV, versus these very broad policies that impact potentially all gun owners. So I guess two questions. One, do you see a trend in the policy landscape? Like we're moving towards more specific, policies that really cover a smaller group of people and try to solve a very specific problem versus these sort of larger, more nationwide. And my guess is, or my thinking around this question is like, it's around political appetite. If there isn't political appetite to do, increase the age or do background checks, then maybe we need to move to this more specific. But just what have you been seeing?
Yeah, Ollie will be able to comment better on the trends. Is in terms of like the IPV, DV specific kinds of laws, I do feel like the surveys that they do about appetite for this in the general public, people generally support these kinds of firearm restrictions for people who have known to have perpetrated domestic violence. So I think there is generally support for those kinds of things. But then also I'm wondering, Ali, let you comment, but also just there seems to be so much more fragmentation by state, and just some states just have so many more types of restrictions, some of them more broader and some of them more specific, but I don't know, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so the question is, whether more specific, like policies targeted in particular population are perhaps more effective or are shown to be more promising, especially considering the political appetite or more broader population level. That's such an interesting question that I hadn't thought about it like that way that you framed, which I think is an excellent question. No, I haven't seen any clear pattern like that. That I would say, like if you go to RAND, for example, and there are other systematic reviews that show which policies so far have shown to have stronger empirical support. I can't say that clearly those that are more like broad population level are more efficacious and effective than those that are targeting a very specific group of people. That's a really good question, but I haven't seen that pattern. And so as Dr. Adhia mentioned, it's very sort of all over the place in a sense. I would say one more thing is that when you look at the surveys and polls among like population in general, whether they like these policies or not, you would be surprised how like overwhelming majority of people across different culture and ideology, political backgrounds support these policies. Like I'm talking about 70, 80, 90, 95% support for these policies, which may be surprising to people who are not in the field because they may feel like we have a divided country, 50-50. It's not like that. It's like more like 80, 90% support these policies, many of them, even the broad level ones. So then it begs the question of why is it not being more implemented, which would be a political science question. We'll stop there.
We could weigh into political.
Yes.
I also very much enjoyed the talk. Thank you. Got me thinking about some other projects I'm working on around implementation and data. Super helpful, kind of training that methodological thinking. I guess what I'm wondering conceptually, we think about this policy domain, which seems to be primarily located around courts making judgments. And I was wondering if there were ways in which there might be other parts of society that could be reinforcing or amplifying what the courts are doing in order, whether that's schools or healthcare or, so that you have a little, maybe could address this issue that you just mentioned about most people are supportive of some sort of gun control. But if it's because there's sort of this location of the policy where they targeted the implementation was in the court system as opposed to somewhere else. I guess, also in the market, it says, but.
Right. That's a great question. Or do you need to go first? So I think the question, I hope I can do justice repeating your question. But I think your question is, like for example, for the one that we mentioned, like protection orders or others, where the center of the action is going to be at courts in terms of implementation. And so it's like there. What other strata or organizations in the society can do potentially to help in terms of uptake and implementation? So it's not just like one unit of actor or action, if that's your question. I think that's a really good one. I mean, the reality is that several of these policies have been written in a way that they are implemented through either a civil or criminal legal system, like the protection orders. Not all of them, but some of them, like the ones that we mentioned today. Now, in terms of protection orders, for example, another really interesting, innovative policy tool that's like one of the most interesting ones right now in the field that we didn't talk about today is red flag laws or extremist protection orders, which is designed to remove firearms from very dangerous situations. The actors of that could be law enforcement, but also could be civilians. Could be civilians who petition the court to remove somebody's firearm. The reality that we see in terms of the actors in more than 20 states that have it is that the overwhelming majority of those who are petitioning are law enforcement, like 85% or 90%. And the petitioners or civilians are a very small group of petitioners. Sometimes they do want the law enforcement to do that. Sometimes they're just not aware that they can do it themselves too. So I think that's an example where maybe more contribution by other members of the community, even civilian population that are not part of the criminal legal system or civil legal system could be very helpful. For the cap law I mentioned as an example or others. But I really don't think that has taken off at all, Sarah, in the country. And I think that we need to do a lot more to be able to jump on those opportunities where we diversify people who can contribute to the process. So the process becomes potentially more implemented more effectively and not being just one narrow domain. But if that domain doesn't work, then everything goes down. Exactly, we don't have capacity or resources. That's a very good sort of structural question. And I hope we move toward that. It's not the reality right now.
One thing I would add to that, I guess, is that even this RGVFEU example, which is, you're right, the implementation is happening in a court, but for the court to have the information to act on, this unit is super multidisciplinary. So they have advocates, they have law enforcement, they have all these different actors who like sort of come together to even get the information so that the court can act on it. So I think it is sort of necessarily bringing in other sectors, even this very like sort of court-based civil legal kind of thing. So yeah, I think there is a way that the other sectors are coming into that, even though the intervention is sort of court-based.
So that was maybe so much to talk about. I was really struck by there's like the knowledge of the members of this policy, and I'm just curious if there are researchers or advocacy groups who are thinking more about upstream, like middlemen in the situation. Some firearms or like where are people getting these first points of knowledge about the policies and the policies that they are.
Great question. Great question. So the question is, when we talk about not lack, but really incomplete knowledge of state policies, are there advocates, other advocacy organizations, groups that are working to promote awareness about this, or working with retailers or others to increase knowledge? Or absolutely yes. Especially, I would say, in suicidology, in suicide prevention, and that domain, I think they are ahead as a field of like interpersonal violence in our field in terms of connecting with, let's say, retailers and gun owners and others to improve and increase knowledge and participation and contribution to suicide prevention. Messaging related to safe firearm storage, working on flyers and others with the retailers at the point of sale to make sure that people are aware of that, and also increase knowledge through training and workshops and other ways of, town halls and others about state policies, like our state policies and safe storage. Those have been, I wouldn't say they have been implemented fully, but I will never say that, but people have taken action on those, which is promising and inspiring. And that has turned out to be one of the maybe less contentious areas on this highly, highly contentious spectrum when it comes to suicide prevention, because so many people have lost a loved one to suicide, or they know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who have died by suicide, and a lot of them are with guns. So a lot of people coalesce around that and try to understand how we could live with these 400 million guns at the same time prevent suicide. Yes.
The dean of the other school will be very happy that we're talking about implementation science. That's right. Clear her hands up. Really enjoyed this. Really impressed with the work that you do as a team. This might be kind of a weird question, but why are insurance companies more involved in this? Like, I couldn't think of another public health crisis that, the insurance companies are like getting rid of policies in remotely risky earthquake areas in our country. Places that have very little exposure to other climate risks. Why aren't they more involved in this, and why aren't they a bigger player in shaping choices?
Good question.
Our ownership is at some extraordinary high rate.
Yeah. So I have a buddy who works on car insurance related issues, and they have all this data about how people drive, what they do, and they set policy rates accordingly. And it's impossible to get home insurance if you're in a floodplain. There's all these things, and it would seem to me that this would be an area where should expect there to be insurance action, but there's not. And I just wonder if is it like a third rail issue? Do we not have good enough data? Are insurance companies not really on the hook for any of these things?
Yeah.
You're so great.
Yeah, I have a couple of things. Somebody who would pay out in there is it's like I think might be like life insurance, not everyone has to. Like for that, everyone has car insurance or car insurance. People have home insurance. I don't think everyone has. I guess I'm sure which insurance.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
So maybe some sort of injury.
Although you said it was a minimal medical cost.
Yeah.
It was. It's billions. It's still billions of dollars, but relative to the 570 billion. No, that's a great question. That comes up all the time. That people are just confused. I wish I had a good answer. Like, I wish there was a convening of all these companies to like talk to them and say, do you want to do that? I really feel like it's partly an issue that you mentioned. And also I feel like it's not where they want to go. I just feel like culturally and politically and others, it's something that has never been picked up. There have been, as I'm sure you know, a lot of conversations around like taxation, right, for ammunition, for particular types of firearms and others, for that tax, for example, to fund gun violence research or others. I can share with you, op-eds, editorials, and others you probably have seen how the reaction to that has been. For insurance companies, I really don't know. That's a really great question. I wish I could pinpoint one reason for that. That comes up all the time, and I don't see any change in that. Very, very like in the way that you're describing. There are conversations around like Medicaid coverage and others, for example, for frontline workers, like professionals that are working in hospital-based violence intervention programs, for them in terms of professionalizations, in terms of the coverage of that kind of care for people who have been shot, but not the type of insurance you were talking about in terms of gun ownership at home and others of this thing.
It also requires a lot of information about individuals having firearms, and that's actually pretty hard information to get. Like like this example we were talking about, just to even figure out who has a firearm and how many do they have and what are they doing with it is really hard.
Well, it's also quite hard to figure out, like, you could think about the person who's permitted or who owns it, that doesn't actually shape who has access.
Right.
Exactly.
Which is probably, I mean, I'm sure your data would reveal that that's actually a huge issue.
Exactly. So it's very, very difficult in terms of measurement of that too, because it's not so clear like a car, as you mentioned, and others, in terms of access and owning. So it's very difficult. And so, well, I haven't talked to any of them directly, but those are just some potential reasons for why they never pick it up.
One more question from Jessica.
We're already at 1:40. It's from someone online, it's not for me. They asked yesterday daily if she's far away from tobacco control and the major strides that were made in tobacco regulation policies is bringing in communication focused on predatory viruses of tobacco despite having substantial energy power for organizations, et cetera. Is this possible for gun violence? Are there ways we can possibly leverage communications or existing communications agreements to talk about local strategy more likely to work?
That's a great question. And so, there are, if you check, for example, the websites or the work at some organizations like Alliance for Gun Responsibility is a very active group in Washington State that stated they do a lot of work on issues around advocacy. And so the question for Zoom participants was around issues of advocacy or lessons learned from tobacco industry and how that has shaped up. This is a longer answer for another day because we're out of time. I would just say that many people talk about things like motor vehicle collisions or crashes, the way I described it as statistics. We're talking about cigarettes and tobacco and others as examples in the past where we have had some success, whether it's in public health or advocacy and others. Those examples are shared and presented in many fora and conversations. I think they may provide some big picture template or guide about how to go about creating a change. Having said that, there are also profound differences between firearms and cigarettes or tobacco or cars that we should not forget as it relates to cultural, ideological, constitutional differences that we should bear in mind, because when it comes to firearms, it's a very, very unique tool, and something that, in our culture, in our society, has a very, very powerful role in the way that's not necessarily comparable to some other products. And I'm happy to talk to you about it more later, but certainly there are some successful strategies that have been shown to have an impact as it relates to some other industries or others. They may provide some general guidelines, in my opinion, but they have to be adopted and become very specific as it relates to firearms and firearms industry.
Please join me in thanking